I've heard my share of crazy stories. Heck, I've lived a few. But if you'd told me a year ago that my Tuesday afternoon would involve two goons dressed like discount GI Joes using a battering ram on my own front door, all because the queen bee of our homeowners association decided my petunias were staging a silent, floral rebellion, I'd have suggested you lay off the daytime television. Yet there I was, heart hammering like a trapped bird, staring at the absolute carnage where my solid oak door, a door I'd meticulously restored myself, used to be. Splinters the size of my forearm littered the entryway, and the frame itself looked like a hungry giant had taken a bite out of it. And standing amidst the debris, trying to look menacing but mostly just looking like overgrown toddlers who'd broken their favorite toy, were two specimens I'd later dubbed Dumb and Dumberer, decked out in cheap navy blue security uniforms with HOA enforcement patches that looked like they'd been ironed on by a drunk. Behind them, practically vibrating with self-importance, was the architect of this madness. Brenda, call me Madam President, McGillicuddy. Drop a comment letting me know where you're watching from, because this tale of suburban warfare is one for the books, and you're not going to believe how it ends. How did I, a reasonably quiet, law-abiding, retired architectural engineer who just wanted to enjoy his golden years tinkering in the garden, end up in a standoff that felt like a low-budget action movie? It all started, as these things often do, with something small, something utterly insignificant. Our community, Whispering Pines, wasn't exactly a hotbed of anarchy. It was the kind of place where the biggest excitement was usually Mrs. Henderson's prize-winning roses, or the annual debate over the exact shade of beige for the community center. Then Brenda McGillicuddy, a woman whose primary life skill appeared to be spending her husband's money on increasingly garish pantsuits and terrorizing anyone who didn't bow to her authority, got herself elected HOA president. She'd lived in the neighborhood for less than 2 years, swept in with a Lexus SUV, the color of blood money, and a conviction that she was destined to rule. Her platform? Restoring order and upholding standards, which, translated from Brenda speak, meant making everyone miserable who isn't me. I first crossed her radar, apparently, because I dared to plant a vegetable patch in my backyard. Not the front, mind you. The back. A neatly contained, meticulously tended plot where I grew tomatoes, cucumbers, and some herbs. According to a passive-aggressive newsletter item clearly aimed at me, certain agricultural pursuits detract from the aesthetic uniformity of Whispering Pines. My tomatoes, apparently, were an eyesore of the highest order. I'd received a curt little notice, printed on aggressively bright pink paper, demanding the immediate cessation of unsightly farming activities. I wrote back a polite letter, quoting the HOA bylaws, which, as I'd made sure to read cover to cover upon moving in, had absolutely no restrictions on backyard vegetable gardens. I even included a photo of my award-winning, at the county fair, mind you, heirloom tomatoes, thinking a little shared pride might mellow her. Wrong. That just seemed to pour gasoline on her already blazing fire of indignation. Brenda wasn't used to people reading the fine print, much less questioning her imperial decrees. Her response was another pink slip, this time with a fine for non-compliance and a handwritten addendum. Your blatant disregard for community harmony is noted, Mr. Henderson. She even spelled my name wrong. It's Harrison. Frank Harrison. I suppose Henderson from the Roses was on her mind. The vegetable garden skirmish was just the opening salvo. Next, it was the color of my mailbox. A perfectly regulation black, mind you, but apparently not the right shade of black, according to Brenda, who claimed to have an innate sense for color harmony approved by the original community developers, none of whom were still alive to corroborate. Then came the bird feeder. My late wife, Carol, had loved watching the finches and cardinals, and I kept it filled in her memory. This, according to Brenda, was tantamount to inviting vermin and disease into Whispering Pines, and created undue noise pollution from avian chatter. I half expected her to demand I silence the crickets next. Each violation came with a pink slip, a fine, and an increasingly condescending tone. I'd respond, always calmly, always factually, pointing out the lack of any actual rule being broken, sometimes even attaching relevant legal precedents I'd looked up regarding HOA overreach. I wasn't trying to be a rebel. I just believed in fairness and following actual written rules, not the whims of a power-tripping tyrant in a lime green pantsuit. Her Tuesday special. As I'd learned, my responses, which I meticulously documented, copies saved on my computer, and printed in a binder I jokingly labeled The Brenda Chronicles, only seemed to infuriate her further. Other neighbors were getting similar treatment, usually those who, like me, preferred a quiet life and didn't attend her community bonding, read, gossip and power display, coffee mornings. There was old Mr. Abernathy, who got fined because his wind chimes were disturbing the nocturnal peace, despite them being small bamboo chimes that barely made a whisper. There was Sarah Jenkins, a single mom, who got cited because her son's bicycle was left on the porch for an hour after school. Brenda seemed to derive a perverse joy from wielding her petty power. She'd cruise the neighborhood in her oversized golf cart, the one she'd had painted a hideous gold, a miniature clipboard in hand, peering at properties like a hawk searching for a field mouse. We started calling it the Chariot of Chagrin. The situation was escalating, moving from annoying to genuinely harassing. I started noticing her driving past my house more frequently, slowing down, sometimes even stopping to glare. It was unnerving. But I held my ground, paid none of the ludicrous fines for non-existent infractions, and continued to respond to her letters with polite, factual rebuttals. I was an engineer. Process and evidence were my bread and butter. I figured, surely, reason would eventually prevail. Oh, how naive I was. The tipping point came with my son, Liam. He's a good kid, though kid isn't quite the word anymore. He's in the Navy. Special kind of work. Doesn't talk about it much, and I don't press. He was due home on leave, his first in nearly 2 years, and I wanted everything to be perfect, or at least, peaceful. The guest room window, an old wooden single pane, was drafty, so I decided to replace it with a modern, energy-efficient double-glazed unit. A straightforward job, all within my property, no structural changes visible from the outside that differed from any other window replacement. I didn't even think to consult the HOA. Window replacement was maintenance, not a structural alteration requiring approval, according to the very bylaws Brenda so selectively enforced. I did the work myself over a weekend. It looked great. Apparently, too great for Brenda. The very next Monday, another pink slip appeared, but this one was different. It wasn't just a fine, it was a demand for an immediate interior and exterior inspection of my property to assess unauthorized structural modifications and ensure compliance with building codes, which, by the way, the HOA had zero authority to enforce. That was the county's job. The letter hinted darkly at further action if I didn't comply within 48 hours. It was signed not just by Brenda, but by 2 other board members, sycophants I knew she'd browbeaten into submission. This was a declaration of war. My son was arriving in 3 days. I wasn't about to let this harridan ruin his homecoming or violate my home. I sent a registered letter back the same day, stating clearly that I would not permit entry without a court order or a valid warrant from actual law enforcement, as they had no legal right to demand such access for a window replacement that wasn't even a violation. I quoted the relevant state laws on homeowner rights and privacy. I keyed my lawyer, a courtesy. I also installed a new security camera overlooking my front porch, a high-definition one with excellent audio recording. If Brenda was escalating, so was I, just more methodically. I half expected her to back down when faced with actual legal principles. Instead, silence. For 2 whole days, nothing. It was the calm before the storm, the quiet hum before the system overloads. Liam was due to land at noon on Tuesday. At 11:00 a.m., that same Tuesday, my doorbell rang. Not the gentle chime of a friend, but an insistent, aggressive hammering. I looked through the peephole. It was Brenda, flanked by her 2 new, HOA enforcement goons. This was it, the final idiotic straw. And it was about to break in a way she could never have anticipated. The quiet hum of anticipation I'd felt for Liam's arrival was abruptly shattered by that aggressive pounding on my door. Looking through the peephole, I saw Brenda McGillicuddy, resplendent in a power blue pantsuit that did nothing to soften her militant expression. Her thin lips were pressed into a line of grim determination, and her eyes, magnified slightly by her severe glasses, glinted with what I could only describe as predatory excitement. Flanking her, looking like rejected characters from a bad police procedural, were the two beefy individuals I hadn't seen before, their HOA enforcement patches, practically screaming, "Wannabe." One was older, with a face like a weathered catcher's mitt, and a gut that strained the buttons of his cheap uniform shirt. The other was younger, trying to compensate for his lack of years with an exaggerated scowl, his crew cut making his ears stick out even more. Neither looked like they were here for a polite discussion about petunias. My earlier preparations clicked into place in my mind. The registered letter I'd sent, the camera recording every nuance of this impending farce, the printout of state tenancy and access laws sitting on my hall table. As a retired project manager, I often told myself when facing complex problems, preparation is 90% of the solution. Brenda's little ambush was, I suspected, designed to catch me off guard, to intimidate me into submission. She clearly hadn't received the memo about my preference for meticulous planning. I took a calming breath. Liam would be landing in about an hour, and I'd be damned if this circus ruined the quiet welcome I had planned for him. I opened the door a crack, the security chain still firmly in place. "Brenda," I said, my voice deliberately calm and even, "to what do I owe this unexpected pleasure?" Her smile was a slash of triumph. "Mr. Harrison, finally, we're here for the scheduled inspection of your property, as per my official notice. You are aware that failure to comply will result in significant daily fines and further legal action. Open the door." She didn't even bother with pleasantries, just straight to the power play. The two goons shifted their weight, attempting to look imposing. It was almost comical, if the underlying intent wasn't so invasive. "Actually, Brenda," I replied, matching her formal tone, "as per my registered letter, which I have a delivery confirmation for, you have no legal authority to demand entry into my private residence without a warrant signed by a judge or my express consent, neither of which you have. My window replacement is perfectly compliant with all county codes and your own bylaws, which, may I remind you, don't grant you arbitrary search powers." I even held up my copy of her letter. Then my registered mail receipt. The older goon grunted. "Look, buddy, just open the door. We don't have all day." Brenda's face tightened, her composure slipping slightly. "This is HOA property, Mr. Harrison. We have the right." "This is my private property, Brenda. Within an HOA, there's a significant legal distinction. The common areas, perhaps. My living room? Not so much. Unless you can show me the specific bylaw, ratified by a majority of homeowners and consistent with state law, that gives you the right to force entry for a routine maintenance item like a window replacement, then I'm afraid you're out of luck." I could see the fury building behind her eyes. She hated being contradicted, especially with facts. "Don't you try to school me on bylaws, Mr. Harrison. I am the bylaws. I am the president. Now, are you going to cooperate, or are we going to have to do this the hard way?" The younger goon cracked his knuckles, a cliché so blatant, I almost laughed. "The hard way?" I repeated, raising an eyebrow. "What exactly does the hard way entail, Brenda? Are your associates here planning to assault me or damage my property? Because I should warn you, this entire interaction is being recorded." I gestured vaguely towards the discreet camera above the door. For a moment, a flicker of uncertainty crossed Brenda's face, and even the goons seemed to hesitate. But her ego, that massive, fragile thing, quickly reasserted itself. She puffed out her chest. "Don't you threaten me. We are empowered by the Whispering Pines Homeowners Association Board of Directors to ensure compliance. Your unpermitted structural alteration poses a potential risk. A window, Brenda? A double-glazed, professionally installed window is a risk? What kind of risk? That it might save me too much on my energy bill? Or perhaps it's just too aesthetically pleasing for your sensibilities. My sarcasm, usually kept under wraps, was starting to leak out. This entire charade was beyond ridiculous. It was then I remembered reading up on Brenda's background after her initial tomato offensive. She'd been a regional manager for a chain of cheap fast fashion stores before her husband sold his software company. She was used to barking orders at sullen teenagers, not dealing with someone who understood leverage and documentation. "Enough of this. Open this door now, or we will gain entry," she shrieked, her voice cracking. The older goon put his hand on my doorknob, as if he was going to try and force it. "I wouldn't do that if I were you," I said, my voice dropping to a more serious tone. "That would be attempted forced entry, and you still haven't shown me a warrant." I saw a malicious glint in Brenda's eyes. This was what she wanted. A confrontation. A way to assert her dominance. She was so blinded by her petty vendetta that she couldn't see the legal and personal precipice she was teetering on. "This is your final warning, Harrison," she spat. "I have 2 authorized enforcement officers here. We will conduct this inspection for the safety and integrity of the community." I simply looked at her. "No, Brenda, you won't. Not without due process. Now, if you don't have a warrant, I suggest you and your team leave my property before I call the actual police and report you for harassment and attempted trespassing." I made to close the door, but the younger goon suddenly slammed his shoulder against it, trying to force the chain. The wood groaned in protest. "Hey!" I snapped, genuinely angry now. "That's enough." Brenda, however, saw this as her moment. Her face lit up with a truly disturbing kind of glee. "Do it!" she yelled at the goons. "Get it open. He's obstructing official HOA business. I'll take full responsibility." And that, apparently, was all the encouragement her enforcement officers needed. The older one, the one with the gut, stepped back, then lunged, his full weight hitting the door just below the lock. The chain snapped like a twig. But before they could shove the door fully open, the younger one, perhaps eager to impress Madame President, produced a small, stubby battering ram from a bag I hadn't noticed before. It wasn't huge, probably something marketed for emergency responders, but bought off a shady website. He took a short, brutish swing. The sound was sickening, a concussive crack, like a giant bone snapping, followed by the shriek of tortured wood. My beautiful oak door, the one I'd spent weeks stripping, sanding, and varnishing, splintered inward around the lock set. Another swing, and the lock itself blew out of the mangled frame, the door crashing open against the interior wall with a violent thud that shook the entire entryway. Dust and splinters filled the air. For a split second, there was a stunned silence, broken only by Brenda's triumphant gasp and the heavy breathing of the 2 goons who now stood panting in my ruined doorway, looking for all the world like they'd just conquered a fortress. Brenda pushed past them, a truly terrifying smirk on her face. "Now, Mr. Harrison," she said, her voice dripping with venomous satisfaction, "about that window." She stepped into my hall, ready to savor her victory, utterly oblivious to the fact that the real battle was just about to begin, and she'd brought a plastic knife to a gunfight she didn't even know was happening. She had no idea who was due to walk through a different door any minute, or whose meticulously ordered world she had just so spectacularly blown apart. The dust motes were still dancing in the shafts of light, piercing through my now violated entryway when Brenda McGillicuddy took her triumphant step into my home. Her 2 thugs, looking rather pleased with their handiwork, lumbered in behind her, casting arrogant glances around my formerly peaceful hallway, as if they owned the place. Brenda's smirk was a masterpiece of smug condescension. "See, Mr. Harrison?" she chirped, her voice echoing slightly in the suddenly cavernous feeling space. "This is what happens when you refuse to cooperate with your homeowners association. A little civility goes a long way." She ran a finger along my antique hall table, leaving a trail in the fine layer of wood dust kicked up by the assault on my door. Now, let's proceed to the offending window, shall we? I want to see these unauthorized structural modifications for myself. She made to stride further into my house, presumably towards the guest room, her discount enforcers starting to follow like ill-trained guard dogs. I was momentarily speechless, not from fear, but from a cold, rising fury at the sheer audacity, the blatant illegality of their actions. My mind was already cataloging destruction of private property, forcible entry, trespass. The list was growing. I was about to articulate these points, perhaps with more volume than I usually employed, when a new sound joined the equation. It wasn't loud. It was the quiet click of a door opening further down the hall, the door to the kitchen. And then, a calm, level voice cut through the tension. "Dad, everything okay out here?" Sounded like someone dropped a sack of bricks. All three intruders froze. Brenda, who had been mid-stride, stopped so abruptly she almost stumbled. Her head swiveled towards the sound. Her enforcers, suddenly less cocksure, exchanged uneasy glances. And then, my son, Liam, emerged from the kitchen doorway, wiping his hands on a dish towel. He'd arrived about 15 minutes early, using the back entrance as he often did, having let himself in with his key while I was preoccupied with the front door drama. He'd probably been making himself a sandwich, entirely unaware of the suburban siege unfolding mere feet away. Liam isn't physically imposing in the way a Hollywood action hero might be. He's lean, efficiently built, not a mountain of muscle, but there's an aura about him, a stillness, a quiet intensity that commands attention without him ever raising his voice. It's in his eyes, clear, direct, and unnervingly perceptive. He's seen things, done things, in service to our country that I can only guess at, things that have forged him into someone who radiates competence and an absolute lack of fear. Right now, dressed in a plain t-shirt and jeans, holding a half-eaten apple, he looked like any other young man home on leave. Except, he didn't. He surveyed the scene, the demolished door, the splintered frame, the three interlopers standing guiltily in the hall, me looking like I'd aged 10 years in 10 minutes. His eyes, which had initially held a casual curiosity, narrowed almost imperceptibly. The casualness vanished, replaced by a focused, analytical calm. "What in the hell happened to your door?" he asked, his voice still quiet but now laced with an undertone that brooked no nonsense. Brenda, recovering some of her bravado, puffed herself up. "And who might you be, young man? This is official HOA business. We are conducting an inspection." Liam's gaze shifted to her. It wasn't hostile, merely appraising, like a scientist examining a particularly puzzling insect. "I'm Liam Harrison. This is my father's house. And you are?" The younger goon, the one who'd wielded the ram, decided to assert himself. "We're HOA enforcement." "We don't answer to you, kid." Liam's eyes flicked to the goon, lingered for a fraction of a second, then dismissed him as irrelevant, turning back to Brenda. That tiny, dismissive glance seemed to visibly deflate the aspiring tough guy. "HOA enforcement?" Liam repeated, one eyebrow arching slightly. "And you enforce things by demolishing private property." He took a step forward, still calm, still holding the apple, but the atmosphere in the hallway had changed. The air felt charged, heavier. "There was a misunderstanding regarding access," Brenda began, her voice a little less certain now. "Your father was being uncooperative with a mandatory inspection of an unauthorized structural alteration." Liam's gaze dropped pointedly to the splintered jamb, then back to her. "Uncooperative, huh? So you authorized these gentlemen to break down his door. Do you have a warrant for that?" "We don't need a warrant," Brenda insisted, though her conviction was visibly waning. "The HOA bylaws give us the right of entry to ensure community standards and safety." The older goon chimed in. "Yeah, it's in the rules. President McGillicuddy said so." He seemed to be seeking reassurance from her, but Brenda was starting to look like someone who just realized they'd mistaken a beehive for a piñata. Liam took another slow step. He wasn't crowding them, not yet, but his presence was undeniably dominant. Which specific bylaw, Madam President, grants you the authority for forcible, non-consensual entry and destruction of property without a court order? I'd be very interested to read that clause. Because, as far as I understand state law, and I make it my business to understand rules and their consequences, what you've just done here constitutes several felonies. Breaking and entering, property destruction over a certain value, possibly conspiracy to commit said acts. You're aware of the penalties for those, I assume? His language was precise, devoid of emotion, but carried an unmistakable weight of authority. The way he said felonies made it sound particularly grim. The color drained from Brenda's face. The younger goon was now looking at his shoes. The older one was nervously eyeing the ruined door, perhaps calculating the cost. I finally found my voice, a bit shaky but firm. Liam? These individuals refused to leave when asked. They assaulted my door with a battering ram after I denied them entry without a warrant. I told them this was all being recorded. I gestured to my camera. Liam nodded slowly, his eyes still locked on Brenda. A battering ram. Interesting choice of tools for an inspection. Were you expecting armed resistance over a window pane? His tone was dry, edged with something that might have been amusement if the situation weren't so serious. Brenda sputtered. This is outrageous. I am the president. You can't speak to me like that. My husband is a very influential man. Liam didn't even blink. Influence rarely supersedes criminal statutes, Mrs. McGillicuddy. Now, I suggest you and your team stay right where you are. Dad, call 911. Let's get the actual authorities in here to sort this out. Before I could even reach for my phone, Liam said, Actually, wait. He looked at the two enforcement officers. Gentlemen, his voice was soft, almost dangerously so. May I see your identification? Your state licenses to operate as security personnel, specifically licenses that permit forcible entry or private investigation? The two looked at each other, then at Brenda, then back at Liam. Blank stares. The older one mumbled, We work for the HOA. Brenda hired us. Hired you to do what, exactly? Liam pressed, his gaze unwavering. Break things? And does Mrs. McGillicuddy typically indemnify her employees against felony charges? Panic was now clearly visible on their faces. Brenda tried to rally. They are legitimate security. Don't you try to intimidate us. But her voice was high-pitched and shaky. Liam ignored her, his focus on the two goons. So, no licenses for this kind of work? No formal training and entry procedures, warrant service, use of force continuums, just enthusiasm and a battering ram supplied by your employer? He paused. You do realize how much trouble you're both in, regardless of who hired you? The silence that followed was thick with their dawning realization. The younger one looked like he was about to cry. The older one just looked sick. It was then that I fully appreciated what Liam was. It wasn't just his physical capability, which I knew was significant. It was his intellect, his ability to dissect a situation, identify weaknesses, and apply pressure with surgical precision, all without raising his voice or making a single threat. He was dismantling them with logic and the implied weight of the law. My son, the quiet professional, was now very much on duty, and Brenda McGillicuddy and her rented goons had catastrophically underestimated the man whose house they had just invaded. The real police were on their way, and I had a feeling the next chapter of the Brenda Chronicles was going to be an absolute bestseller in the annals of epic takedowns. The suburban quiet had been shattered, but a different, more profound kind of order was about to be restored. The wail of approaching sirens, a sound usually associated with distant troubles, now pierced the artificial quiet that had fallen over my violated hallway. It was a strangely comforting sound under the circumstances. I had made the 911 call as Liam had calmly deconstructed Brenda McGillicuddy's authority and her hired muscle's composure. I'd kept my explanation to the dispatcher concise. Forced entry, property destruction, 3 individuals still on site, one claiming to be an HOA president. I made sure to mention the battering ram. That detail seemed to elevate the priority. Brenda, whose face had cycled through a spectrum of outrage, indignation, and now dawning horror, made a desperate attempt to regain control. "This is a misunderstanding," she exclaimed, her voice teetering on the edge of hysteria. "We can sort this out internally. There's no need for the police." Liam, who had subtly positioned himself between the intruders and any potential escape route, not that they looked like they were going anywhere, just gave her a cool, appraising look. "I believe that ship sailed, Mrs. McGillicuddy, right about the time your associates took a power tool to my father's front door. Attempting to interfere with a 911 call or discouraging witnesses is also, by the way, a separate offense." I'd advise quiet contemplation at this point. His words, delivered with the same unnerving calm, effectively silenced her. She just stood there, deflating like a punctured bouncy castle, her power blue pantsuit suddenly looking less power and more pathetically blue. The two enforcement officers looked like they wished the floor would swallow them. The younger one was actually trembling slightly, his eyes darting between Liam and the front door, as if gauging the likelihood of a successful sprint past a man who moved with the fluid grace of a predator. I almost felt sorry for them. Almost. They'd made their choices. 2 police cruisers pulled up, their lights painting strobing patterns through the mangled doorway. 2 uniformed officers, a seasoned-looking sergeant named Miller, and a younger officer, Henderson, the irony of that name was not lost on me, stepped out and approached cautiously, their expressions professionally neutral but clearly taking in the scene. The demolished door, the scattered debris, the 3 individuals standing awkwardly in the hall under Liam's watchful gaze, and me, the presumably aggrieved homeowner. Sergeant Miller spoke first, his voice calm but authoritative. "All right, folks, what seems to be the problem here?" Before Brenda could launch into her carefully curated version of events, I stepped forward. "Officer, thank you for coming. I'm Frank Harrison, the owner of this home." These 3 individuals, led by Mrs. Brenda McGillicuddy, the president of our HOA, I nodded towards her, forcibly entered my home after I denied them access without a warrant. They used a battering ram to destroy my front door. I pointed to the offending implement, which lay discarded near the threshold. Sergeant Miller's eyebrows rose a fraction. He looked at the door, then at the ram, then at Brenda, whose mouth was opening and closing like a beached fish. "A battering ram? Ma'am, is this true?" Brenda found her voice, a shrill, defensive squawk. "He was violating HOA bylaws, an unpermitted structural modification. We have the right to inspect. He was being obstructive." "So you decided to unobstruct him with that?" Officer Henderson gestured to the ram, a note of disbelief in his voice. Liam then spoke, his tone respectful but firm. "Officers, my father had previously informed Mrs. McGillicuddy, in writing via registered mail, that she and the HOA had no legal standing to demand entry without a warrant for the alleged infraction, which was replacing a window. He has documentation. He also informed them at the door today that their entry would be unlawful and that he was recording the interaction." He gestured to my security camera. Despite this, Mrs. McGillicuddy instructed these 2 individuals, who claimed to be HOA enforcement, to breach the door. Sergeant Miller looked at Liam, then back at Brenda. "Ma'am, your name and position again?" "Brenda McGillicuddy. I am president of the Whispering Pines. Ho! And this young man is interfering." Liam simply produced his driver's license and military ID, handing them to Officer Henderson. "Liam Harrison, officers. I arrived home shortly before this escalated to the door breach. I'm here on military leave." Henderson examined the IDs, his eyes widening slightly as he registered the U.S. Navy and whatever else was on the military card. He subtly showed it to Miller, who gave Liam a longer, more thoughtful look. There was a distinct shift in their demeanor. They'd likely encountered military personnel before, and Liam's quiet confidence, his precise language, and his bearing now clearly marked him as something other than just some young man. The goons, who I later learned were named Butch Kowalski, the older one, and Ricky Tripp, the younger one, were then questioned. Their stories were a muddled mess of, "Brenda told us to," "we thought it was allowed," and "it's an HOA thing." When asked for their security licenses, they produced nothing. Butch apparently had a lapsed security guard license for unarmed mall work from 5 years ago. Ricky had nothing but a Blockbuster video card from 2003 in his wallet. It turned out Brenda had hired them from a Craigslist ad seeking security-minded individuals for assertive community standards enforcement, promising them a hefty bonus if they could resolve the situation with me. The term resolve had apparently been interpreted rather broadly. Miller and Henderson exchanged a look that spoke volumes. "Mrs. McGillicuddy," Sergeant Miller said, his voice now carrying a distinct edge of official displeasure. "Instructing individuals to forcibly enter a private residence, especially without any legal authority and with the use of tools like that battering ram, is a very serious matter. We're talking potential felony charges here: breaking and entering, vandalism, possibly conspiracy. Are you aware of that?" Brenda's face was now ashen. The fight had completely drained out of her. "But the bylaws. I'm the president," she stammered, her voice barely a whisper. "Ma'am, HOA bylaws do not supersede state law, or the United States Constitution for that matter," Miller stated flatly. "Your internal rules don't give you, or anyone you hire, the right to act like a wrecking crew." He then turned to Butch and Ricky. "And as for you two, performing security functions, especially those involving forcible entry, without licenses and proper authority, not to mention actually committing the act of breaking in, you're in a world of trouble." I provided my statement, detailing the months of harassment, the fines for non-existent violations, and my attempts to resolve matters reasonably. I offered my binder, the Brenda Chronicles, and the SD card from the security camera as evidence. Sergeant Miller looked through a few pages of my meticulously documented correspondence with a growing expression of incredulity, occasionally shaking his head. The camera footage, which Liam helped download to a patrol car laptop, was damning. It captured everything: my polite refusal, Brenda's escalating threats, her clear order to breach the door, and the enthusiastic efforts of Butch and Ricky. The audio was crystal clear. "Well, Mr. Harrison," Miller said after reviewing a portion of it, "this seems pretty clear-cut. Your camera did a fine job. Butch and Ricky were cuffed." As Officer Henderson read Ricky his Miranda rights, the young man actually started to cry, muttering about how he needed the money for his online crypto course. Butch just looked defeated, the bravado completely gone, replaced by the weary resignation of a man who knew he'd profoundly messed up. Brenda wasn't cuffed on the spot, but Sergeant Miller informed her that she was being detained for questioning regarding her role in inciting criminal damage and forcible entry, and that she should contact her attorney immediately. He made it very clear that charges were highly probable. As she was escorted unceremoniously to one of the patrol cars, her power blue pantsuit looking utterly ridiculous in this context of actual law enforcement, she shot me a look of pure, unadulterated hatred. But there was fear in it too. The Queen Bee had been dethroned, not by a rival, but by her own staggering arrogance and a quiet engineer who just happened to have a Navy SEAL for a son. Liam watched them go, his expression unreadable. He then turned to me, the tension visibly leaving his shoulders. "You okay, Dad?" he asked, the concern genuine. I surveyed the wreckage of my doorway. "Better now, son. Much better. Though I think I'm going to need a new door." He clapped me on the shoulder. "We'll get you a stronger one. Maybe something steel reinforced, with a better lock." We both knew the storm wasn't entirely over. There would be legal proceedings, HOA meetings from hell, and a lot of neighborhood gossip. But the immediate threat had been neutralized, spectacularly. The chariot of chagrin was, at least for now, out of commission, its driver facing a reckoning she never saw coming. And my son, the unassuming hero, just wanted to know if I was still planning on making those barbecue ribs he loved. Some victories are best celebrated with good food and family. The aftermath of what the neighborhood soon dubbed the Battle of Harrison's Hallway was swift and, for Brenda McGillicuddy and her hapless henchmen, brutal. Butch Kowalski and Ricky Tripp were charged with felony breaking and entering, vandalism, and conspiracy. Given their lack of licenses and Ricky's tearful confession that Brenda had promised them an extra $500 each if they made an example of me, their legal position was about as sturdy as my demolished door. They both quickly sought plea bargains, reportedly agreeing to testify against Brenda in exchange for lesser charges. This, I learned later, caused Brenda's very influential husband, who, it turned out, was more influential in regional widget distribution than in circumventing felony indictments, considerable ajita, and legal fees. Brenda herself was charged with inciting criminal damage, conspiracy to commit breaking and entering, and a host of lesser HOA-related misdemeanors that the local prosecutor, upon reviewing the Brenda Chronicles and the damning video footage, decided to pile on with what seemed like a certain professional relish. Apparently, our little HOA wasn't the only entity Brenda had been trying to run roughshod over. Rumors of her bullying behavior in other community roles started to surface. The legal wheels ground slowly, as they often do, but they ground exceedingly fine. My meticulously kept records, the clear video and audio from my security camera, and Liam's calm, credible testimony — he provided a formal statement before his leave ended — formed an airtight case. Brenda's defense, from what I gathered, was a rather pathetic attempt to paint herself as a well-meaning community leader who was simply misunderstood and victimized by an uncooperative resident, me, and overzealous but naive employees. The jury, and later the judge, didn't buy it. Her reign of terror over Whispering Pines came to an ignominious end, not with a bang, but with a guilty verdict on multiple counts, and a sentence that included significant fines, a lengthy probation, mandatory anger management counseling, and, most deliciously, a court order barring her from ever serving on any HOA board in the state again. The judge even made a pointed comment about abuse of power and the sanctity of private property rights that had me resisting the urge to stand up and applaud. The HOA itself was thrown into chaos. The two board members who had co-signed Brenda's inspection demand resigned immediately once the charges were filed, claiming they had been misled and pressured. A special emergency meeting was called. It was standing room only, the community center buzzing with a mixture of shock, anger, and a surprising amount of schadenfreude. For the first time, people who had long suffered under Brenda's thumb felt empowered to speak out. Stories poured forth, tales of ridiculous fines, vindictive enforcement, and a general atmosphere of intimidation. Mrs. Henderson, whose roses had miraculously never drawn Brenda's ire — perhaps Brenda had a grudging respect for horticultural excellence, or, more likely, Mr. Henderson was a retired judge — actually stood up and thanked me for lancing the boil. The praise was awkward, but gratifying. A temporary board was elected, comprised of sensible, level-headed residents who were more interested in genuine community well-being than in power trips. I was asked to serve, but I politely declined. My HOA politicking days were done. I'd had my fill. However, I did offer my meticulously organized Brenda Chronicles as a case study in what not to do, and volunteered to help a newly formed committee tasked with reviewing and revising our bylaws to ensure clarity, fairness, and robust protections against future abuses of power. We added term limits for board members, instituted stricter transparency rules for financials and decision-making, and even established an independent arbitration process for disputes. My new front door, by the way, was a custom-built, steel-reinforced, solid mahogany unit. Liam had insisted on overseeing its specifications before he returned to duty. It had a state-of-the-art lock system and, humorously, a small, discreet brass plaque near the peephole that read, "Warrants welcome, solicitors by appointment. HOA overlords, not so much." It was a little piece of defiance that always made me smile. The cost of the door, the frame repair, and my legal consultations were eventually covered by a settlement from the HOA's insurance, after Brenda's actions were deemed outside the scope of protected board activities, forcing her own finances to cover the bulk of her legal woes and court-ordered restitutions. More importantly, the atmosphere in Whispering Pines changed. People started talking to each other more. not in hushed, fearful tones, but openly. There was a renewed sense of community, born from a shared experience of overcoming a petty tyrant. My vegetable garden flourished, untroubled by pink slips. Mr. Abernathy's wind chimes sang freely. Sarah Jenkins' son could leave his bike on the porch without fear of incurring Madam President's wrath. Liam, when he called, was pleased to hear about the changes. He never said much about his role in the denouement of Brenda's reign, other than being glad I was okay and that common sense had prevailed. For him, it was just another situation that required a calm head and decisive action. He was more interested in whether my heirloom tomatoes were ripening on schedule for his next leave. He'd done his part, protected his family, and then quietly stepped back, which is the mark of a true professional. The story, of course, became something of a local legend. Remember the time Brenda McGillicuddy tried to go to war with Frank Harrison and his Navy SEAL son? People would chuckle. It served as a cautionary tale for other HOAs in the county and a source of considerable amusement for the officers at the local police precinct, who apparently used snippets of my security footage, with my permission, for training purposes only, of course, in their what not to do when dealing with the public seminars. It was a surreal, stressful, and ultimately vindicating experience. I wouldn't wish an encounter with a Brenda McGillicuddy on anyone, but I learned a few valuable lessons. Know your rights. Document everything meticulously. Don't be afraid to stand up to bullies, no matter how much power they think they wield. And, if all else fails, it doesn't hurt to have a highly trained, incredibly composed son who happens to be home on leave when things go sideways. So, if you're out there dealing with your own HOA nightmare, take heart. Sometimes, all it takes is a little bit of knowledge, a lot of perseverance, and perhaps an unexpected ace up your sleeve to turn the tables. Drop a comment below if you've had a crazy HOA story. I can guarantee, after what I've been through, I can probably relate. And thanks for watching. Keep fighting the good fight, and always, always read the fine print. You never know when it might just save your front door or your sanity.